Okay, we are ready to roll.
Excellent.
Hey, I'm here too.
Hey, Marilyn.
All right.
Go ahead. Whoever's calling roll. Marilyn, would that be you?
Yep. All right.
Okay.
Jen Bates,
Here.
Matt Bowman, Rich Gussenberg,
Here.
Ann Harrigan,
Here.
Jim Jinks,
Here.
Andrew Martelli,
Here.
Renee Martinez,
Here.
Chuck Neff,
Here.
Sylvia Nichols,
Here.
Kate O'Donnell,
Here.
Jeff Pengaro,
Here.
Anthony Saragini,
Here.
and Don Walsh.
Here.
Okay, we have a quorum.
Thank you very much. I'll stand for the pledge. Thank you, Arnett.
Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag
Flag.
of
The United States of
America
America.
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is to talk about our mission statement, and I'm actually going to throw it over to Chuck Neff, who is going to lead us through this topic.
So hang on one second. Let me just share here. All right. Does everybody have my screen, the mission
Yes.
statement here?
Yep.
So the idea here, I wanted to look back at the mission statement, just going off of some the conversation last week. We can start back here, talk about the mission statement, and then, I'm hoping that can kind of guide our discussion for the rest of the agenda items here. So bear with me as I read through this, and then I also wanted to touch on where we were at with the RFP. So statement of the mission for the School Modernization Committee. The Cheshire Public School facilities range in age from 48 to 107 years old. In addition to providing education services, these facilities also serve as social and recreational hubs for our community. School Modernization Committee, SMC, has been established to consider available options to upgrade the school facilities, which may include new construction, renovating existing facilities, closing and repurposing facilities, and other creative viable proposals. The SMC is tasked with developing recommendations for modernizing our schools that will address the educational needs of CPS students in the 21st century while considering the fiscal impact on the residents of Cheshire. In developing its recommendation, the SMC may hire consultants, engineers, or other professionals to assist with strategy and plans as the SMC deems appropriate. The Town Council has appropriated $150,000 to cover such professional fees. The SMC shall present their recommendations to the Town Council and the Board of Education as soon as completed, but not later than March 1st, 2021. So kind of starting with that, and then I also wanted to look back at the RFP that we had from almost a year ago now, and just kind of talk how we had put this out and we had acted on the hiring a professional firm. And these were the phases that we had kind of laid out. So we had pre-referendum phase 1, discovery and assessment. And you can see through here what we were doing. We're reviewing information, and this was more or less the discovery and assessment phase, right? We'd kind of looked at the info that was available, analyzed the enrollment projections. We developed a comprehensive demographic focused enrollment projections, and now we're into phase 2. And the only reason I kind of bring this up, and I just want to talk through what the committee feels this recommended plan entails, and if we can agree on what our deliverable is for this March 1st, 2021 date, or whatever date that may be, we can kind of regroup a little bit and talk about how we get there with the information that we've done to date. So I'll kind of open it up from there. What does everybody feel like this recommended plan entails that we must deliver to the town of Cheshire on the 1st? Does anybody have any comment on that? Don't be shy.
Well, this is Renee. I think plenty has been done to date, and I think that the deliverable looks like a report, and I'm just saying what comes first thing that comes to mind. I think the deliverable comes as a report that is backed on all the data that has been gathered to date. So, and I think that report is going to have a conclusion, and it doesn't have to be one option, but I think it has to be perhaps a rank of options that we consider viable.
Thank you, Renee. So you're thinking just a report. We present essentially a report on all the options that we've kind of gone through and the one or two of what we have.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind.
I mean, what level of detail do we think that includes? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead, Don.
Well, in reading that, it really states that it has to be fiscally manageable. So I think we need to remember that and not just present a plan without making sure it's going to be fiscally manageable. And I know, I'm assuming we're going to get the figures tonight. But you know, that's one of the things I was hoping that we would have had them before tonight, so we could have all looked them over. Because I know that you know, the communications committee had them, but it would have been nice if we all had them, so we could have had some kind of idea of what we're going into. But I think, you know, that's one of the more important parts of it, and it has to be fiscally manageable. And you know, also phase one has to be a standalone project. It can't be something that we're going to say, okay, well, we're going to do this, but we have to do this right after that. We have to make sure that whatever we present to the community is something that will be a standalone project, hoping that the other phases will follow through. You know, I mean, we would want all the phases to go through naturally, but I think we have to concentrate on the phase one with a plan for the future of what we will bring. Because, you know, phase 2, 3, and 4 could change 5 or 10 times over the next 5 or 10 years. So, you know, but, you know, we need to make sure that we get that phase one right, and it needs to be fiscally manageable. So.
Yeah, so I think you're saying like a master plan with a more detailed phase one of what that first project is to go to referendum.
Yes.
Anybody else? Go ahead, Kate. And I see your hand, Sylvia, next.
Well, one of my things that I've been thinking about a lot is, you know, when we present the plan, I know we don't really have a lot of time, but having a location for where these new schools might go, I think is going to be an important piece for us. And I'm not sure if that's possible, or, you know, just if we're talking about fiscal responsibility, we don't know if we need to purchase a property, if we have a property. Like, I think that's a really big question mark that I'm hoping we can resolve, or at least get closer to resolving before we present a plan.
That's good. And I think we'll touch on that a little bit during the next agenda item of an update. I don't want to get into the weeds of any of the details. I know what you're saying on the location, and I think we'll touch on that hopefully in the timeline and deliverable part of this. That's good. I mean, having a location for where it is. Anybody else? I mean, again, this is the Community 13. Go ahead, Sylvia.
I just need to have a little clarification, because I agree with everything everybody said so far. My question is, and I advanced this to Sean, and I'm not sure that I'm absolutely clear. We need to go to referendum with a project and a detailed cost of that project will be approved to spend that money on behalf of the town. However, we also are working to develop a long-term plan on which we will build on that first phase. So we have phase one, and we at some point need to make sure that the public is aware that phase one is part of a proposed long-term plan, and that this referendum that we're asking people to vote on at whatever time the referendum is, November, is for phase one. But somehow we have to communicate that we have developed this phase in conjunction with a long-term plan. And my question is, maybe Sean, if you're here, I don't see, or if somebody can clarify for me. Are there two questions that we're going to be asking the voters to approve? One, an overarching long-term plan with no specific dollars attached to the entire plan, or are we also looking for a referendum question that then approves only phase one of this project? My concern, the reason I ask the question is because my concern is we build the financial expectations about phase one and we talk about impact of taxes and all of that on the individual, but phase two is also going to impact taxes over a long period of time. It's not immediate, but it's how do we propose, and where does our proposal need to be in order to be informative to the public? That's where I'm struggling.
Yeah, go ahead, Robin. I think, yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Thank you. And Jen and I spoke earlier today. She had asked if I could attend tonight to try to give a little more clarity from the council's perspective. And I know you have 3 council members here and a number of Board of Ed members, but to try to react at least to, some clarity from the council's perspective. From my vantage point, and certainly jump in any other council members if you disagree, we need to get as detailed as we possibly can, because at the end of the day, whatever the council and Board of Ed are going to approve needs to be based on some level of certainty. And I think we're going to rely on that, and the public is going to rely on that when it goes to referendum. So we're going to need as much detail as we can. And I think the mission statement is pretty clear. We want to make sure that we provide a plan that works for the school system and our kids, but is certainly based in some fiscal responsibility. And that's really the rub, to try to marry the two of those. And I think that's probably where, we all get a little bit stuck, because if we had an open checkbook, we'd just write a check and we'd do it all. But unfortunately, I think you realize we can't do that. So to answer Sylvia's question, I see it as this. The presentation would outline the overall plan, which gets you from day one to the finalization of the plan, whether it's a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, whatever the completion of school modernization is. And then we have to eat that elephant one bite at a time. And it would, to me, the first phase of that is what would go out for referendum and would be voted on. But certainly the taxpayers would understand that this is only one phase of a larger plan that's already been proposed to them. It's going to be very difficult to opine on the cost of a plan that may not start for 4 or 5 years. So phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, depending on when they start, the community is going to need to understand what those financial impacts are. And I don't think can do that at this stage. So I think you've got to outline the overall plan. I think we need to look at phase 1 as our first referendum issue, knowing that depending on what happens with phase 1, if anything even goes beyond that we've advanced that ball quite a bit towards school modernization. We don't know what the community's appetite will be down the road for phase 2, phase 3, or phase 4, but hopefully it'll be a well laid out plan that hopefully we can follow over some time frame. And again, I think each phase needs to stand on its own, because what we can't do is advance phase 1, which is predicated on phase 2 getting approved. And unfortunately, if it doesn't, we leave the school system open to not having facilities to serve them the way we need them to. So I think, we've got to look at the big picture, but we've got to do it one phase at a time and know that each phase stands on its own. And again, I'm going to be looking for as much detail as we can. And I think the financial information is going to be critically important because we're going to need to relay that to the public. So it's really a combination of two. What works for you? What can be financially absorbed by the community? And I think the sooner you can get that down to 1 or 2 options and begin to really dive into the financial impacts of those, I think it'll start bringing some clarity to the group. So that's kind of my overall thoughts.
Thank you for that, Rob. Tony, is your hand up there?
Yeah, I echo pretty much everyone's sentiments. Additionally, with Rob too, I think the charter is clear, and based on the information as it's been developing throughout the course of this MC, the plan has been building step by step. There's more detail. Last week, we saw even more lines of milestones for the options we discussed. I assume tonight we're going to see more financial details on what those milestones cost. And I think the options, all of them that we ranked, look at the short term and the long term, look at a comprehensive plan, whether it's one phase or several. So I only say that because the board and town council, all of us, we're looking for the long-term plan, kind of see how things fall into place. We know we have immediate needs, which the committee is very well aware of. We also know we have phases that we can do that stand on their own, which Rob iterated. I think we're seeing that, and I guess, and I apologize if I missed an email. What is causing this question tonight? Is this we're not clear what that packet's going to look like when it goes to the town council?
From my perspective, I would say that some of the conversation at the last couple of meetings of not having a site, some concern that we're moving too quick and that we need to fully develop the plan, focusing maybe only on phase one versus not the overall plan. I just want to make sure we're all clear as far as what we're trying to put forward to the town council on March 1st and what that looks like as far as a deliverable. And if everybody is agreeing with a master plan that has details focused on what the first referendum is, that's fine. And we can move on to the next steps of this. But I think that there may be some confusion or maybe we're not all on the same page. And that's just my perception. I could be wrong.
All right, thanks, Chuck. For what it's worth, and I'll relinquish the mic in a second. I'm okay with not having a site tonight specifically for any one of these options. I would think and hope that by the time the final options go to the Board of Ed and Town Council respectively, that we at least have some idea of parcels that might be candidates. And I say this because although this is a different and more detailed plan than the last one, when the board then presented the long-term plan, again, didn't focus on the immediate, but the whole picture, the site was unknown, and we did have discussions on potential sites. The point there was, I think even here, as long as we, as a group, feel the data points we have, the scoring that we did, all the details on how these options solve for the short and long term, I think we do that without the site. The only caveat I have, I think this is where you're going with Chuck and Don, is without knowing the cost of that site, that might be a factor in the financial analysis. So I would hope that by the time something leaves the committee, we have something preliminary on potential sites. That's my only feedback. Anyway, thanks, Chuck. Thanks for answering that.
Thanks, Tony. Go ahead, Matt.
It's been me that has been pushed for the site because that is part of the total package and it's part of the total cost of something which we are going to have to propose and put in front of the voters. And I understand that it has to go to the town council first and the Board of Ed, and it has to meet with their approvals in order to move forward. I keep pushing this because it could certainly affect the price tag of the project. And I really think that we need to have some sort of budget number in place for the proposal to go forward. I had 3 separate people come up to me and talk about this, and their major concern of these projects was consolidation. So we can't, in my opinion, you're going to have to go past phase 1 to say after phase 1, we plan on moving X to Y and Y to Z, and we're going to close A and we're going to close B, and we're going to have a savings of E. But I'm very serious. 3 separate people in 3 different age groups asked me the same question. What are we going to save by doing this? And it's a concern to the taxpayers in this town. And that's why I want to be sure that whatever we present to the town council and to the Board of Ed on March 1st, we have as complete a number as possible. And if not, I'm going to say this again, I'm sure the town council would be more than willing to extend our deadline. And to do this the wrong way, we are just begging for this thing to go down in flames. And I, for one, do not want to see this happen. We need the complete package. We need all the information we can get to these voters. Thank you.
Got it. And I understand that. I guess that's kind of what we're trying to do, is understand what we want that plan to look like for March 1st, so we can, get there. So, I mean, if that's the general consensus, is we need a land site, I guess I would leave it to Chuck to kind of how we're going to get there and develop these scenarios and stuff. Go ahead, Rob. I see your hand.
Yeah, my apologies, folks. I'm not looking to dominate the conversation, but I haven't been part of the group for a while, and I wanted to make sure that you have had an opportunity to do your work. And Jen and I did speak earlier about some of these questions, and I want to give you at least my perspective from the council as to some of these questions. And I think relative to whether we need to know a site or not, my thoughts are this: to the extent your plan in any phase includes existing school property, then I think you can dive into that to some great extent. You should be able to include those costs in your plan. Now, how deep you go from the presentation to the Board of Ed and Council may be slightly different as to when it needs to go to the public and referendum, because I think by the time we get there, we need to make sure we've got real solid numbers, because I think the public is going to be relying on what we provide to them and making a decision based on that. And I also think their decision could largely be based in where that facility is. So to the extent we can control that with property we own, I think we need to make that available to the council, the Board of Ed, and the public as soon as possible, and dive into it as best we can. Now, if it's not a town-owned property and you're talking about building a new school and we don't have facilities that we own, I personally don't think it's this committee's responsibility to go out and start negotiating or finding vacant land that some private property owner uses. It would be my suggestion, and only my suggestion, and there's 3 other council members here, that in that instance, you put a plug number into your analysis. And, I'm sure Colliers, who has done this a lot, can help you with this. You can put a number in for acquisition of the land and some basic estimates for geotechnical and all of that kind of stuff. And obviously, before we get to the public presentation, we're going to have to hone in on that a bit more. But that's how I see it. I don't envision this group really going out and knocking on doors and saying, would you like to sell your property? We might be interested in using it for school modernization.
Thank you, Rob. So I guess, Chuck Warrington, I kind of want to look, we can kind of go into the macro timeline and kind of how that tied into the RFP phases that we had there, and kind of see where we're at, because I think it was always planned to kind of develop that land piece of it after we've kind of presented a preferred option to the town. So can you pull up the schedule, I guess, and maybe kind of step us through what the plan is for developing the land portion? Because I think that's the biggest question, maybe.
Sure. When we thought, can you see the macro schedule here? All right, Chuck?
Yep.
Okay. So this is something we haven't probably looked at since November. I'm looking at the date, and I haven't updated it on purpose just because it's been a little while since we've looked at it. And I think we've been so entrenched with the phase 2 process of developing options, that I felt like we had to pull back a little bit. And I was telling Chuck and Jen, maybe we took a look at the scope that Chuck showed and kind of review what were some of the steps we outlined. And it's an outline, and it's subject to change. Just kind of listening to the discussion, I think we all have to understand this is an iterative process. We're going to have to develop to a certain point, looking at financials, and we've done that for phase 1A and 2A tonight. And it's an initial evaluation, and it's something to respond to. And this committee will have questions on it, and I'm sure we'll have to go back with Jim and Ben and refine it a little bit and have some discussion. But I think the first thing is understanding it's not a pure linear process. It's going to be iterative, and we might have to go back, and we're going to have to look at different options and moving some things around. So I just wanted to kind of put that context on it. So obviously phase 1 The pre-referendum phase 1 per the RFP was just, again, compiling documentation, reviewing all the prior studies, et cetera. We hired SLR, Malone and McBroom, to do the demographics and the enrollment studies, earlier, mid to late 2020, looking at the capacities of school. We did that in October, and we went through that on that plan. And then the next step was developing the scenarios, right? And getting into those little by little. We looked at what the enrollments were doing. It was telling us that, again, everything you already know, but the elementary schools were showing being stressed very soon. Middle school, high school has adequate capacity for those. We started drafting these scenarios, and they massaged and they moved. And again, an iterative process of throwing in different ingredients and potential solutions. And frankly, that we're getting close to the end, but it's not done. It's not final, because we may look at the financials, and this committee, town council, must say, hey, go back and take a look at this and give us a different combination, if you will. A scenario two, we had 2A, 2B, could be 2C, could be 2D. Again, we got to get through that. But looking at our schedule, we looked at initial development of the scenarios. We're down that path, performing initial site assessments. We looked at some early. Really, it's the first project because, frankly, the renovations or CIP plans are on existing property. So the only really evaluation was, can we add additions, right? And we talked about that a couple times. If we need to, we can revisit some of those sites and show you what our assessments were. Be happy to do that. But I think the primary one is if there's a new school or new facility on a different parcel, getting a little bit deeper into that. And I think we're kind of getting very close to that step, right? I mean, we're dialing down. We have essentially 2 options based upon last meeting, and we're starting to dial that in. There have been, speaking to the site, there have been some past studies back in 2017 that I don't think we should ignore. That's work that's been done and looked at, and I think we should look at those again, because the firms that did them, Taisu Kim Partners, architect, very reputable firm. Malone McBroom was on that as well, very reputable firm. So we don't want to dismiss those and take a look at those. And I think some of those were on town-owned parcels, and that's what we've been assuming so far, is that this new project would go on a town-owned parcel. But again, we got to vet that out. If there's private ones, we don't know what they are, and we can look into the cost. But and agree, Rob, we could throw a plug if we need to. If we need to throw a plug for a worst case scenario, and go based upon a need of 25 acres or whatever we estimate the acres to be based upon what the state recommends, we can look at the cost per acre. We have realtors on our side on Colliers. We're a huge corporate real estate firm. We can reach out to our colleagues and go, what do you think a price of that property would be? Also, looking at land values with you folks. I'm sure you guys have people, within the town that have that expertise. But, preliminary budgets, we've certainly done those. We've done those high-low ranges. As we kind of, develop project budget ranges for each option. We've done that. We've looked at those and shared those. Again, then we talk about, hey, revising the scenarios and the total project budget based upon feedback. It kind of alludes to this back and forth, and we're still kind of in that process, frankly, and it's not 100% vetted out. Review the scenarios and the budgets. That was shown in the end of December. And again, I keep stressing this iterative process. We'd scheduled to meet with OSCGR. I think we're going to touch upon that later. I don't know if Jen or Chuck, if you guys touched upon it yet, but we did have our initial meeting with them today and kind of present to them what we've been looking at. And it was about an hour and 15 minutes long. We weren't able to get into too many of the weeds, but just to introduce them to the work that this committee has been doing so far. I think it was a positive meeting. I think they were appreciative of us coming early. That's done. So, that had us in 1.8. We're a couple weeks behind there, but overall, I think that's pretty good for as many options as we're looking at and the work we're doing. But the really the next steps, and I think seems to be the crux of the conversation is, yes, the committee making a presentation to the town council, or it might be a review of all the options, and what that looks like seems to be under a little bit of flux. But the next steps is dependent on this master plan, and this master plan that we're talking about, the scenario is, it is just that, and it's subject to change. I think, Don, you mentioned that plan is most likely, going to morph over time based upon your needs, based upon debt, what the debt service is in the town, and other factors that, are that I won't be able to predict at this point, but things change over that amount of time. I mean, we're looking at 12, 14 years for this plan, for these scenarios. But those are aggressive. The scenarios are, do a referendum this year, phase 2 assumed, and maybe we need to look at that 3 years from now. But you may say, hey, we can't afford to do it 3 years now. We got to wait and let the debt impact kind of settle out a little bit. And Jim Jascott can speak to that. But looking at the sites and the next steps is, once the scenario as a plan, and again, it's a concept, right? It's not, we can't tell you the exact budget of what a high school project's going to be. We can give you a range based upon what we know today. That has to be refined. Certainly for the first referendum or phase 1, whether it's 1 school, 2 schools, to be determined, right? I mean, we have to look at the impact. We're saying get as much as we can in phase 1, but does that mean just one, say the middle school and a New Chapman, or is it just the middle school? That's to be determined, and we're going to talk about that. Jim Jascott's going to share some numbers for the entire plan, but we have to have a start and look at it, let you react, and let us go back and refine numbers and do deeper dives based upon the information. So. And then eventually, once you approve a scenario in this concept, then we'll go and we'll do those deeper dives, and maybe we do the studies, for the sites. There's nothing prevent us from doing those now if we have some identified. Again, town-owned is the assumption of doing some geotechnical borings that we've recommended in the pre-referendum phase 3. Nothing's saying we can't do it now at the end of pre-referendum phase 2. Nothing's preventing that. Or doing a phase 1 environmental site assessment to look at the historical use. We could do that now. Those just take some time, and we move them up. So I frankly, I think saying, okay, there's this deadline of 3/1. Yes, that's the goal. And we can present everything we have to date with the estimates and the ranges. If we want more definition on a specific site, then we'll need to know that, and it'll just need to take a little bit of time. But there's nothing saying you can't do it now or you have to do it later. I think it's really up to you of what's going to give you the best value to make a decision on a scenario. And maybe it is doing some of that homework. Or we can do the plug as a worst case and go, we're just going to plug in a couple $1 million for a site.
Thanks, Chuck. My opinion, I guess that's why I wanted to talk about it. I'm not sure. My opinion has always been that we were presenting a master plan, and phase 1 of the master plan is what would be developed after our presentation. We were just presenting a logistics plan of, this is how we would address modernizing the schools. These are the approximate steps, cost of those phases, and then following that presentation is when we got into the development of this. And again, maybe that's my misunderstanding. Maybe I'm wrong, and you don't have to agree with me. That's just how I've took it. And I'm just interested in how everybody else sees it, because I feel like there's some differing opinions on this. So that's the only reason I wanted to kind of talk through this a little bit tonight. So, Andrew, I think I missed your hand there earlier. Did you want to comment on anything on the mission statement plan?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm kind of following what everybody else has said. I feel that the presentation to the town council needs to start with all of the information that we've gathered from the touring the school facilities, touring the outside school facilities, the demographic study, the enrollment study, and formulate what the immediate need is for the school district and what the first phase is and why we came to that decision with our back, our sheets, all that formulated into a clear, concise presentation that people could actually listen to within a reasonable amount of time as to why we're recommending for phase one. So if we are going to do the phase one, I think that the phase one should be fully developed with what the project is, where it is, how much the project is going to cost, and how it immediately addresses the needs that we came to identify that the district is immediately facing, and then go on to phase two and say, okay, as phase two and phase 3, 4, whatever goes out over the next 10, 15 years, how we see that laying out, but subject to change. Knowing that phase one is our immediate need. Phase one, this is what we figured out. We've all spent a lot of time. There's been subcommittees and groups. We've reached out to the community and how we can cure that immediate need in phase one. And that's why we want this to go to referendum in such a short period of time. So that's where I am with it. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Go ahead, Renee. Sorry.
No, I 100% agree with Andrew. I mean, we're sitting here on January 27th, and I think that we have a month to go to comply with our deadline. I think we need to comply with our deadline. I think that not doing so will jeopardize being able to file for the state grant this year, and I think that'll be a great disservice to the town. So I think we need to take this month that we have left and focus on what we can control. If we need to provide a block number for the site, if that becomes the first option, I think that's the way to go. But I think we cannot get distracted right now. I think we need to focus on trying to wrap this up the best way we can. If more information is needed after the first submission to the council, maybe we submit a Ref 1, they come back with comments, and then we submit a Ref 2 with more information. But I think we need to try to start charting our table of contents and going at it and not get distracted.
Okay. Thanks, Renee. Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Chuck. I would just follow up on Renee's comment. Obviously, we all want to move this forward as soon as we can and hopefully comply with the June requirement for the state application and then hopefully referendum in November. But from my vantage point as one of the council members, if you all believe you need a bit of an extension, I do not think that's going to be an issue. So I kind of leave that in your hands. I don't think, and again, there's 3 other council members here and a bunch of Board of Ed members. I think the reality here is we need to get this right. And if you think you need a 30-day extension because that 30 days will really help you do what you need to do and hone in on the final specifics and still allow you to get where you need to get relative to June and then November, I don't think that'll be an issue from the council's perspective. Again, I'm only one individual, but that's my thoughts.
Anybody have any? Go ahead, Jim. So, sorry, I saw Jim, Don, and then Sylvia.
Yeah, I mean, sitting here where we are today, I don't see any reason why we as a SMC can't put together, basically what we know now, what we developed to this point, coming over the next few weeks of honing in on an option, maybe a second option, but probably one option, having all the background as to why we arrived at that option, having the financial details we need to have as best as we're going to have them, and then perhaps having a location or two, in whether detailed or just as a placeholder. I have every expectation that we as a group, we can deliver that by March 1st. But again, if we need a little bit more time, so be it. But I don't see why, sitting where we are today, I don't see why we need an extension.
Don, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think didn't Chuck Warrington, I think he said really April 1st is the drop dead time that we would really need to get it to the council in order to get things going. So I think, that extra 4 weeks, I'm not going to say we can have it done or we can't. I still think there's a lot of work we have to get through because I don't think we have a concise plan that we all agree on yet. And what might end up happening is we may end up coming up with two options that we're going to present to the council as well. So, but I still think we do have that time if needed. Am I right on that, Chuck?
Yeah, and if I could, I want to, if I could just share again what it's going to take to get to the referendum and the RFP. I just want to be clear and make sure everybody understands, I guess, the timelines and expectations of that. Of depending on once you decide, okay, here's a scenario and here's the project, the first project or projects. I'm not sure. If we've taken, say, those soil borings and then the phase 1 environmental site assessment, then that's great. That's done. That's a big step in part of the process. But what would also would have to occur is, at a minimum for the grant application, is developing educational specifications with the Board of Ed. That's purely under their purview. That process it takes some time because you have to have, typically you hire, there's people that are out there that have drafted ed specs that are very good with it, but they schedule meetings with Jeff and his administrations and the staff that's going to be in the school to develop this program. And we have templates for it. But then there's a process of doing a first reading with Board of Ed. I believe a second reading, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tony or Jeff or Vin, that's typically what we've seen as a first and second reading. So to approve those and a budget, a final budget. So they're just in itself is probably 2 to 2.5 months just to do ed specs and have those submitted. Then there's and you can advise us of, for going to referendum in November, we have to obviously have a final budget. We have to know what the budget is to submit to the state. I don't think if it's a case of a site acquisition, I don't expect that a placeholder would, that we have to talk with them when we go back to them to see if that's even adequate. If not, they might be concerned, and we'd have to talk to them about it. Most of our projects have been already town owned, but if it is town owned, obviously that alleviates that. And again, I think we should look at those studies. But then from there, it's making sure we line up with town council to. There's establishing resolutions that they're going to establish a building committee, authorize preparation of schematic drawings and specifications, and then permission for the Board of Ed to submit the grant application. So it can happen. It's just there is a series of items that have to be approved and executed and submitted by that June 30th date. Not saying we can't do it, but I think, Don, long story around, April 1st is probably the latest we'd want to start. That's and that's saying we have a very detailed milestone. We know what the option is. If it goes into April or May and there still isn't, a determination of the scenario, I'm concerned that we're going to be very challenged to meet June 30.
So if we give two options to the town council, April 1st may be too late. So you're saying that we have to have whatever option we're going to go with by April 1st. Is that?
Ideally for that first project, just because we have to do those ed specs I talked about. If we start April 1st, maybe in 6 weeks to develop just the ed specs. If we do the homework in that April 1st, like say if we do, again, the phase 1 environmental, if we front load some of these efforts early and you agree upon what the site may be, that helps to schedule dramatically. And we are working on that final budget in preparation. And then once the ed spec's done, we plug that in pretty easily. And we'll have it already drafted. It's really just tweaking the budgets for the most part. And then getting you the language for town council to approve, approve holding a referendum, number one, approving what the budget would be, for that. So.
Okay, that's good enough. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Rob. You're muted.
Yeah. Chuck, what approvals, if any, do you need prior to submission to the state? Do you need both Board of Ed and Town Council approval before that submittal goes in?
Yes, so the Board of Ed owns the ed specs. So the only thing that they technically have to approve and certify is approval of the educational specifications for that project. So either the new elementary school, middle school, whatever the project is. So we have to draft and approve. And I think that can occur there. Just, again, we can't start it in the middle of May and expect it to be done by June. It just, it's too tight, definitely by April 1. The other one, so there's 3 resolutions, and if I can bring those up to you, but there's 3 resolutions that any grant application, the governing body must pass, and those ones I mentioned of, the schematic design drawings, the establishing the building committee, and allowing Board of Ed to submit to the state for a grant application. So typically, and then the other one, Rob, is typically the funding authorization, but general statutes, because you're doing a referendum, says that as long as you establish, and the wording, if you talk to certain council, they may say it's got to be very specific to a date. I think you probably go November 2nd is what we're guessing for election day. But as long as you certify to the state that you are going to hold an election and report the results no later than November 15th of 2021, which is a statutory date, then that would satisfy the funding portion, per se, of the grant application.
Okay, so and thank you for that. So in essence, we need to make sure that you have both approvals in place and those resolutions done before that June submittal to the state, which means that both the Board of Ed and the Town Council needs to have a very deep level of detail to be confident that they're comfortable advancing this to the public based on the presentation. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to understand that if the drop dead date is April 1st, to be able to submit for the June, at that point, the Board of Ed and the council needs to have as much detail that it believes it can provide to the public to make a definitive answer. And unfortunately, and I know there may be some disagreement on this, but I'll just say it straight out. One of the concerns of the council the last time around was that there was not enough information for the public to make a clear decision, and there were some unanswered questions. So I would make sure that we can have a period of time to try to get those unanswered questions done so that both of those bodies can make an appropriate decision and hopefully support the project and move forward, knowing we're going to get this to referendum in November.
Agree, Rob. And I would say Jeff's not here tonight, Vince, I can certainly chime in, but the CPS Board of Ed definitely needs the information by April 1st to get the ed spec done in time, developed to a great level of detail, and have the 3 readings and vote. So to me, it sounds like the go, no go is April 1st. Do we hit that date or we don't?
I think that's fair, Tony, is a late target.
Go ahead, Matt.
If the property is owned by the Board of Education, I think you're fine. But if the property is owned by the town of Cheshire and has been either acquired or it has been acquired by the town under some sort of open space project, this might have to go back to the public if we choose a public piece of property that has that contingency on it. Therefore, we might need another referendum to get permission unless it's a Board of Ed project, unless it's a Board of Ed piece of property as it exists today. Is that correct?
Who's that question to? I don't.
Rob?
Rob, go ahead, Rob.
I'll do my best to answer it. And certainly, Matt, that's a good question. Clearly, we don't want to advance a project that's predicated on using a parcel that would violate some use restriction that the town took title to under. So clearly, if you identify a piece, we're going to have to do some due diligence that there aren't any restrictions that would preclude us from building a school on it. And I agree with you. We're going to have to do that ahead of time prior to any submittal to the state.
That's why I keep saying we need to have a piece of property identified. Thank you.
Thank you both. Chuck, I actually had a question. What the April 1st drop dead date is predicated on the June 30th application for the grant. What is the implications of missing that date? And say we worked through that and held a referendum, maybe even still in the fall if we got there, or if it was in the springtime, what are the implications of missing that date? What does that do?
In a nutshell, what it would just do is it pushes back, if you pass a successful referendum, say November or spring, you could submit you could submit an application in say 2022. All it does is push back your reimbursement, your first, when your grant commitment, again, your grant applications in say, 2021, typically you'll see a grant commitment, which means the legislatures passed the funding. They looked at the priority list and said, yep, you're going to get reimbursement. Now there's an agreement. Typically June, July of the following year, depending on the session. It kind of varies. In this case, if you couldn't make the 2021, I wouldn't panic about it, because if you pass a referendum in say November, okay, that's when projects start in earnest, is funding authorization. The state of Connecticut goes, nothing's reimbursable until funding authorization occurs. You could start architect selection, design phase. Say if you submit in June of 2022, we'd have a better idea. We'd have an idea by then if the state supports it, because we're talking to them. But in December of 2022, they have to develop the priority list, and that is published on December 15th. That's a letter that goes to the governor from the Office of School Construction Grants and Review with recommendations for these projects for a priority list. And then ultimately the following spring legislative session, they're acted upon, and you'd have theoretically a grant commitment in 2023. The impacts of that are really just a matter of funding those design phase dollars, those soft costs, primarily architect. Hopefully, if we're involved, would be some OPM and maybe some CM fees for pre-construction, but really not necessarily construction dollars per se. We'd have to look at the schedule, but it just pushes back really your reimbursement from the state a year.
Got it. So just to follow up to that, if our master plan and phase 1 right now has a shovel in the ground date of, let's say, 2025. Yep. If we were to miss this date of this year, does that change that shovel in the ground date? Or if I'm hearing you right, is it just we won't be reimbursed until we get that grant commitment on the first phases? So we would be risking, whatever the upfront costs are for an architect over that town. Is that right?
Yeah. So looking at the schedule, and if you want, let me just share it with us. I'm just looking at 2A, Chuck, and just so everybody can see what I'm looking at here. Make sure I'm looking at the right screen. Can you see this schedule?
Yes.
Where it says scenario 2A here. So this was part of the schedule we had to put together to help us with the cash flows. So in a 2A scenario, we had shown a grant application being submitted to June of 2021. You can see in this green bar here, and I'll blow this up a little bit for those at home. We'd expect a grant commitment sometime summer of 2022, again, depending on the session. So as you can see, if you pass referendum in November of this fall, you really don't start in earnest, activities and accruing some bills until probably March or April, realistically speaking. You just do an architect selection. There's really nothing happening those first couple of months. If you get the grant commitment, typically August, September timeframe, we're drafting up a reimbursement request to submit to the state through Board of Ed, the superintendent, and you're probably getting your first payment October, November of 2022. So now if I was to take both of these just for, because I think graphically this, if I was just to slide these a year, just to kind of give you some context, and that's in June. Okay, based upon this schedule that we have, it works out pretty well, because if this schedule is to maintain as is, and we do the design phase for the middle school in Chapman, and again, this is for demonstration purposes, we'd be expecting to have a grant commitment that summer of 2023, and we're looking to go out to bid in May. So that's really close, because what we have to get permission from the state of Connecticut to go out to bid either way. But by this time in this process, if come May, we know if we're going to be on the priority list. State of Connecticut's going to go, we already know what the price, because in December of 2022, we see the priority list, we know if we're on it, and we've never seen anybody taken off to date. So they know if we're going to go on it. It's a matter of, okay, where's the legislative session? And say if we wanted to go out to bid before the grant commitment, I suspect in this scenario, the state of Connecticut would go, we're going to go through your plan completion, review all the approvals. We're going to allow you to go out to bid. However, it's, reimbursement still subject to the grant commitment. And until you actually have that, they can't promise that, right? They just, statutory, they can't do it. So you'd be right there where you would need to be. It'd be a pretty close schedule here, where construction's when you start accruing the big dollars, right? That's where the big money starts coming in, and you're paying, $1 million up to $2 million, $2.5 million per month. You got to get those reimbursements, faster, where the design phase, there's still some bills, but it's not like construction.
So in this scenario right here, if I can, and then I'll stop.
Sure.
Is
Yeah.
If this were the case,
Yep.
the design fees in that time before we get grant commitment,
Sure.
that would be money that the town would be paying, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to get reimbursed for that until the grant commitment was actually made. Is that
The
right?
letter, yeah, until the superintendent receives the letter, we can't file for reimbursement. However, these fees are reimbursable. Let me just make it clear. Design fees after the referendum, they are reimbursable in a new construction project. And then you can get the reimbursement fall of 2023, roughly.
Got it. And I'll just say, I only ask this because I'm concerned with the level of detail that it sounds like we may want for this April 1st deadline. I'm concerned that I don't think we have that level of detail ready. And if we're talking about land, it's good to know what the implication of that is. That's all. I'm not suggesting we push the date. I'd just like to know what happens if we did. Does anybody have anything else on timeline, what our deliverable is? Any other thoughts on any of that stuff before we move on to the financial review stuff?
Yeah, I do have one question. Can I?
Go ahead, Sylvia.
I just want to think that through, and the years are confusing me. We still could go out to referendum in November of 2021. We just could not apply for the grant until June of 2022. Is that correct?
The thumbs up from Chuck. That is correct.
All right. So that doesn't mean that we can't put it out to referendum and people can't make a decision, and the impact would be that the town would have to fund those initial design costs over a period of time, which would be reimbursable eventually, but we would have to pay it up front.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to make sure I've got it clear.
Yeah, and Sylvia, many districts do go for referendum prior to submitting the grant application. South Windsor, we've talked to them. They did their referendums in March of the year. They did it in March of 2020, submitted the grant application in June. we started design. Bills didn't start coming in until September. They're on the priority list now, and hopefully this year, this summer, they get a grant commitment. Certainly wouldn't recommend wait until a grant commitment, because you talk 3 to 4% escalation on construction, you're talking a big chunk of money there.
And you would lose the momentum because we are publicizing this effort and people know that we're working on it. So to put off a referendum just because we have not applied for the grant seems to stall the project much more if we did that. It would seem to me we ought to be moving forward with steps to get there. If we can't make this June commitment, we still should have the referendum and put that grant application in.
Yeah, and by then, I hope it's safe to assume that we have all our ducks in a row. We've done all our homework. We know all the factors.
Right.
And what it also does is dependent. I don't know if anybody's familiar with a non-advocacy period. Because that's basically when, as public officials, you can't endorse any referendums. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, but I think it's 45 days, but I'm not an expert on it. But there is a blackout period and non-advocacy period, and hopefully that reduces that period by not setting it so early, for it. But I think you're right on, Sylvia.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so the final piece of this is the date of March 1st as it is right now. We'll leave that for now, talk about it. We have a meeting on Monday, so we can talk about that on Monday. There's only 2 meetings between now and that March 1st date, or do we want to talk about that now? Anybody? Very good. We'll leave it for now. Is there anything else on timelines, deliverables, anything there? All right. I'll turn it over to Chuck again to go through the financial review of the scenarios. Is that you or is it Jim who's gonna go through that?
I think John's going to present the PowerPoint, but this is John's going to walk us through the agenda. We're going to pass it off because this is a multi-team effort here. Vin Masiana, he has his the work he did from the capital, their CIP plan, the 5 to 15-year term. We're going to talk a little bit, show you a little bit about how we did the cash flows, because we feel it's important to show you kind of how the cake is made, if you will. We want to just show you the detail, not too much in the weeds, but if anybody has any questions, and then pass it off to Jim Jascott to show you what the results he's seeing for some of the bonding and the tax impact. And want to stress up front that when he shows this, it's for this initial pass, and I'm sure there's going to be response and concerns. The initial pass is for the entire scenario for all the projects. It's not just for phase 1, it's for the entire scenario. So that'll pass it off to John.
All right. Good evening, everybody. As Chuck was saying, this is essentially a mutual presentation between a couple of us here tonight to go through the financial impacts. But what this will do is attempt to show the history as to where and how we got to the cost ramifications for both scenario 1A and 2A. Those are the 2 that we have concentrated on based on some of the prior meetings and discussions with the committee. So I will begin. I'll turn this over to Vin, who can start with the initial discussion here as far as some of the costs associated with the the CIP process and costs with the town. So I'll turn that over and then they'll turn it back to me momentarily.
Okay. Thank you, John. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. John, I'll just tell you when to flip the slide. So
sure.
What I wanted to start with is to just explain the assumptions that were used on the capital budget and operational savings. And then if you like spreadsheets, John Copeless will show you how he's integrated some of these assumptions that have been built into the model. As Chuck said, these are initial assumptions. We've built the worksheets so that we can make adjustments to the assumptions. So what I'll present now is, these are the assumptions that have been built into Jim's model, and Jim will wrap up, this portion of tonight's agenda with what he's prepared. So if you switch to the next slide, jump right in. The capital budget, and just so that everybody that is on this committee and anyone who's watching and our other guests understand, the capital budget, when we're talking about this next section, this is what's separate from the operating budget. The capital budget is what's used by the schools and by the town to fund building improvements, construction, purchase of equipment, acquisition of land. If we were to renovate a school or build a new school, it would be appropriated through the capital budget process. The projects have to have a value or cost of $110,000 or more, a lifespan of 5 years or more, and be non-recurring in nature. The town council annually approves a 5-year capital expenditure plan, and they also approve the actual funding for the first year of the capital plan. And any expenditures over $500,000, whether they're for one project or they're accumulated over a period of years for the same project, those are subject to voter referendum. So those are the rules that are followed as it relates to the capital budget at a very high level. Go ahead, John. So what I'm starting with is this pie chart shows the 5-year capital plan that's just been proposed to the Planning Committee of the Board of Ed. So it's still under review. It hasn't been approved by the Planning Committee yet, but we are meeting tomorrow evening. And after the Planning Committee, it goes to the Board of Education and then ultimately to the Town Council. So this is as proposed, but this is the starting point that we used for developing the capital budget assumptions in the model that you'll see in a few minutes. So you see at the bottom of this slide, it's $37,729,000 has been requested for maintenance and repairs to our 8 school buildings and grounds over the next 5 years. And I'm just going to walk you through the high level detail. So of the 37 million, 30%, about 11.2 million is for window replacements, across the district schools. There's a lot more detail behind this. We have this broken down school by school and project by project, but this is the high level summary. So 11.2 million for windows, another $8.2 million roughly to replace roofs, sidewalks, masonry improvements, as well as paving of sidewalks and driveways. District cafeteria improvements, about 15%, 5.6 million. And then as you see, the pieces of the pie get smaller. HVAC improvements, 3.2 million. Other improvements inside our buildings, 2.6 million. Code compliance, 2.4 million. Fire alarm control systems, 1.7 million. And so the list goes on. So that's the baseline that we used for the first 5 years. But we're projecting out a 15-year assumption. So I'm going to ask John to flip to the next slide. And actually, John, you could go right on to the next slide. This is the same thing, just summarized. So if you look at this, the first bullet, 37,729,000. That's the baseline. That's what I just showed you in those pie charts. And the funding year over year, year one, 21, 22, the request is 5.2 million. And then you could see in the second year, it's 8.8 million, 7.2, 6.5, and just about $10 million in the 5th year of the plan. For modeling purposes, though, what we did is we said, if a project is approved in 21, 22, you won't need the cash until the following year. So we took the year that it's included in the capital plan, added a year, and for Jim's purposes for projecting cash flow, he just moved it to the next year because that's when you would need the funding and potentially the borrowing through bonding. So the average funding, I'm right down at, not quite on the second major bullet yet, but average funding per year in the first 5 years is $7.5 million. So to project the next 10 years, what I used as an assumption is we would fund capital at a 50% rate based on the first 5 years of the plan. So years 6 through 14, we're just funding about half of what we would fund in the first 5 years of the plan. So the average actually comes out to about it's half of the 7.5 million a year. And so these assumptions were then taken and modeled not only by year, but by building. And that'll become important, and you'll see that in the next slide. So John, if you could flip to the next slide. So that first bullet that talks about baseline, what we've modeled out is assuming that there is no school modernization, we keep our 8 school buildings, and we continue to make capital investments in those buildings. We're assuming that those capital expenditures will total about $71.4 million. Okay, so that's essentially the capital cost keeping our buildings the next 5 years. What was built into scenario 1A, which Jim will take us through, the capital expenditures will total $22.9 million. So you're avoiding capital expenditures of $48.4 million in scenario 1A. And the reason for that is you are making improvements or replacing a building in actually 2 buildings in scenario 1A. So that's why you're spending $22.9 million instead of the full $71.4 million. And then under scenario 2A, it works the same way. You know, in scenario 2A, you will spend 34.13 to your existing buildings, but you're avoiding capital expenditures of $37.25 million. So those are the baseline assumptions. You know, I know there's kind of a lot of information that's been summarized there, but I just wanted everyone to get a baseline understanding of how we assumed capital project funding would occur in each of those 2 scenarios. And then I guess I'll turn it back over to you, John, to take it to the next level of detail.
Yes, what I'll do is look at switching my screens now, because I have some of these spreadsheets on another screen here. So let me just switch screens, make sure I grab the right one. Okay, so hopefully you're now seeing a screen here with 4 tabs at the bottom. And the first 2 tabs are what Vin was referring to on his prior slide there with respect to the capital expenditures. And you'll see here on this row, I'll try to blow this up a little bit. This row here, this is the total, the 71.38 million, or that is allocated for the capital expenditures over that course of the time frame here through those years. So what we did is we took scenarios 1A and 2A, and based on the scenario and what schools were being addressed, either through renovation, through CIP, and or being demolished, we then took the calculations and those costs that Vin had projected and put those to each of these schools. So in this scenario, this is the 1A scenario. The Dodd Middle School, the renovation project, the box in blue reflects when the referendum would occur. The green box reflects when the construction would occur. And if there's any red box in any subsequent locations, that's when that location would either be closed or demolished. So what we did is then took any of these CIP costs that had been projected from Vin's calculations and reduced those or deducted those from the future costs based on when and what was being done to each of those schools. So that is done for each of these schools in the 1A scenario. So working our way down, I don't want to bore you with all of this, but working our way down to the bottom line is resulting in those numbers that was on that previous slide. So again, this is the 71.38 million that was initially forecasted. This reflects the actual numbers based on the deductions from those various schools that are not going to be incurred under the CIP program. And then this reflects, this bottom line here, this row reflects the savings accumulated from all of those schools that do not need to be addressed to that full extent. And then that in turn reflects that $48.4 million savings. So that in a nutshell is how we got to that first step. So taking that step, we then go.
Hey, John, can we
Yes.
pause there? Can you pause there? Go back there for just 1 second. And I think we might have, I just want to make sure we don't have an error in our slide. The red numbers at the bottom here in yellow.
Yes.
Are those the cumulative savings that we've recommended? The cost avoidance?
Those are the end results of what these costs that had been calculated. This is what Vin's number was, this
Yep.
5240, for example.
Yeah.
This is what the actual number now becomes.
Okay, so the 438 is the
438,
actual
that's
savings?
the savings. That's the delta between
Okay.
the adjusted savings and the original costs.
Okay, good, because it's pretty heavy in this one. I just wanted to make sure we were, portraying the number correctly
Right.
on that, if anybody had any questions. Also, John, can you explain in some of the scenarios where we deleted from years 6 to 15, where we zeroed out, like in cases of renovation?
Sure. I can go back.
Yeah.
Yes, let me go back to, let's take, for example, the high school. So in this scenario, the Cheshire High School, the referendum would be in the year 2029, for example. The construction itself would begin in 2031. So based on the construction happening in 2031, the renovation work, we would go back 2 years prior to that, and the $619,000 that was being carried as a CIP cost would go away based on the fact that we're going to be performing these renovations. So as you'll see in this line here, those numbers or costs that have been forecasted are zeroed out. So that's how the number down below accumulated between the various schools is reduced from the 3.589 million all the way down to 487,000, because the work potentially forecasted for the high school in conjunction with some of the other schools, such as the middle school and or any of the elementary schools, those would all be zeroed out. And that ultimately results in that end number for that year, for that 2030 to 31 year. No longer is the 3.589 million, but it's actually the 487,000 due to the fact that, some of these renovations have occurred by that date.
And just to clarify, these are just our assumptions. Anyone could probably argue you take it a couple of years, we went, 2 years before construction or
Correct, 2 years
in
prior.
the high school. That, of course, could be debated either way. It's just a recommendation to model this to try to reflect, realistically some of the savings in here, and also to clarify these assumed, and these are just assumed referendum years based on, the schedules you put together for the sake of getting to this point. It's not cast in stone by any means, but in order to get us to some type of financial impact, we had to make some assumptions initially for us to give Jim and also Vin the information that we ultimately want to give to you.
Correct. Another example is for Humiston. Based on scenario 1A, that building would be closed in 2025-26. So 2 years prior, the costs that were forecasted for window replacements, as well as anything that was in the future, such as code compliance. There was $2 million allocated in 2026 for Humiston. That would be deleted due to the fact that Humiston is being closed the year prior. So I hope that makes sense. I can't see everyone's screen, so I'm not sure if there are any questions. I'll pause if there are any at this point before moving on.
Any questions on how we got to these, or assumptions, or a lot of numbers to look at here?
I have a quick question. You know, it's kind of hard to see on the screen. Can
Yeah.
you provide us with this afterwards so we can take a look at it in a little bit more detail?
Oh, sure. We can share whatever you'd like afterwards. It's just a little bit tricky to try to show all this because it is so small, but we can certainly share with you whatever you'd like afterwards.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this step?
And then similar for 2A, right, John? Again,
Yes,
based
similar
upon
for 2A.
schedule that we put together, and
Each component that's impacted either, again, through renovation or CIP, the referendum date highlighted, the construction start date, and then anything that's impacted, potential savings that can be avoided is calculated and brought through to, again, the bottom line. And again, this is where you see the end results, this being the potential cost, 34.18 instead of the 71.3. And then the savings here would be about 37.24 on the 2A. Yes, Chuck, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, so again, this is just based on the scenario 1A phasing that we had discussed last week. So if phases 2 through 4 in those scenarios were to move around, these cost avoidances would also be adjusted.
Correct.
That's
Yes,
the
this
first
is
question.
Yes, that is true.
And then the second part is there hasn't been any step to see if there was any other optimal phasing of those 2 through 4. Like if for say the high school were to go in phase 2 versus phase 4 of that, is there a huge cost avoidance there, or have we not looked at that part of it yet?
We have not studied that, although to be honest, that wouldn't be too challenging to just move things around and determine, which would go next as far as the subsequent phases. But, this is based on the prior scheduling or phasing that had been originally proposed.
nothing prevents that from happening, Chuck. Again, these are assumptions to, again, this iterative process. We have to make a certain amount of assumptions to get to a certain point. I'm sure you've all done this in, the course of our lives and then you go, okay, let's try a different scenario, and we switch it up and we redo the numbers.
That's all I was getting at, is this was the starting point. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yep.
Correct. So are there any other questions?
Don has a question there. Don.
Okay.
I just have a question because, in I guess shuttering Dodd, if we were to hold it for a swing school for future projects, would that change the amount of improvement? I mean, we would need to keep that school up if we're still going to be using it until we're done with it, correct?
Correct. So, for example, this is the 2A. So Dodd in this case is being used as the swing space. So the assumption is that these costs here that were proposed under Vin's calculations as far as CIP costs would still need to occur due to the fact that the school is being used up until 2930-31. So yes, if the schools are being used for a swing space or are, depending on when they're going to be demoed, if there is something that is forecasted, more than likely it is still going to need to be carried, and that's how we've reflected that, Don.
And Don, just to kind of clarify that too, these are some really high level assumptions where the fact is that Dodd is obviously still, unless you sell or demolish, it's going to be a town asset. And for the SMC exercise, our understanding is take it off the books. It's not coming from Board of Ed. But I think the reality is that you still have an asset in town. So it might come from another bucket, but for the purview of this committee, we understand we're taking it out here. So just want to make sure that, if anybody's watching it, we're we don't want to be perceived as being short-sighted or not seeing the reality of that property and that asset to the town. So somewhere there might be some costs. What those are, who knows? We just want to kind of put that clarity on it.
And Chuck, just to add to that, the other item we're not assuming is if you do take a building offline, and let's say the town does sell the building, we're not assuming any gains from sales of any property either.
Chuck?
Hey, go ahead, Matt. John, I think Matt has a
Yes.
question there.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yes, the question, could you send us this information? This is a lot of information to dissect, and I'm glad that it was touched on that it is a town asset, so these numbers might be saved under the school budget, but certainly could be added to the town budget if the town decides to keep this building for, I believe Sylvia had mentioned before, things like a library, things like park and rec, things like Arts Place, maybe even possibly a future senior center. So this certainly is an asset to the town, and these numbers might just go from the Board of Ed side to the town council side. So there really might not be a savings here at all. But could you send us this information, please?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll send those through the chairs, Matt, and share these. And I think it's a good point. I think that's honestly a struggle we've had of maybe not a Board of Ed expenditure, but until the town, and we've seen it many times in other districts where, okay, it's not no longer a school or functioning, but it's sitting there. You have to insure it. You have to keep it watertight, heat it minimally, right? And there is a certain level of maintenance, even with an empty mothballed building, it just doesn't go away. And I think, I've heard other districts, taxpayers going, well, there's still going to be a cost. It's not a zero cost to maintain the building. And I think that's just being realistic about it.
Thank you.
As Chuck mentioned, earlier, our assumption, we had to make a couple assumptions here, but our assumption was that if and when any of these buildings were demoed and or taken offline, that the cost essentially would go to zero. But to your point, there is still the potential that would be, costs incurred, either through the town or, other avenues. Any other questions, anybody, before I move on? Okay, I'll take that.
John, Rod had something.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say, I think that's an appropriate way to look at it. What we don't want to do is add additional capital projects to the SMC equation here. I think at that point, it's an appropriate assumption to say, we're going to zero it out, and then the town council or whatever powers to be would make a decision at that point as to whether we want to sell it and bring that cash into our equation, or whether it becomes part of another capital project, which we think about going forward. But I think it would be unfair to SMC to say, you need to carry that expense for some extended period of time. So I think the way you're looking at it, in my opinion, is appropriate.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
We all set to move on? No hands? Okay. So the next screen here is showing, again, this is something Chuck had touched on a little bit earlier, but these are the forecasted schedules for each of the phases associated with the different scenarios. So this is associated with scenario 1A. And what this is showing is the forecasted timetable for the various phases through this scenario. So this is when these years are going to be impacted by not only the design, but also the construction costs. In this case, with phase 1 is the demolition of Chapman, comes into play at this point in time. And then this works down into the subsequent phases. So as we work our way through this chart, and this is several years wide and numerous rows deep, but this shows each of the phases. And as these are forecasted, this is what comes into play and is factored into the eventual cash flows. So I just wanted to show this as another one of the steps in the process. And then in this scenario 1A, the last of the 3 phases proposed would be the high school renovation. And as you can see, that is forecasted out to 2032 for start of construction, all the way through to 2034. So again, that's just another one of the steps in the process here, but that is what is factored in as far as determining some of the cash flows. So this information is then added into what we have as our cash flow. And what this chart is, it shows, again, this is scenario 1A, and we're taking what is the first phase in this scenario. In this case, what we are doing here, let me just scroll up, would be the K through 6 elementary school. So if I come back, these correlate with the prior schedule. And what this does is this takes all of the costs that are reflected here on the left for the various components associated with each of these projects and takes the construction cost and then separates that out over the time frame for the construction itself. It also will take, moving down here, the architectural fees, and those fees are spread out during the time frame allocated for the design phase. So each of these phases is allocated on this spreadsheet and then also is broken out based on when these fees are incurred for that project. And as we go through the chart, you'll see that the subsequent phases, in this case, the renovation of Norton, we then proceed over to when Norton will start, which is in 2025 for design. And again, those same costs are then allocated and distributed through that time frame associated with each of those steps. So all of that information is then compiled and was sent over to Jim, and he will now take over and explain how he derived the costs associated with each of these scenarios. So let me stop sharing, and I'll go back to the slide presentation and turn it over to Jim.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, John. So you've obviously put a lot of work into these cash flows. So my job was really pretty easy because I just converted that to debt service. And that's what I'm just going to kind of go over quickly with you now is what was involved in that process. So, John, I think there's a schedule here that shows my projected bonds, and I think it's after this one. We could come back to this schedule after.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
So what I've done here is I've projected the bonding needs for scenario 1A. And again, this is a approximately 12-year timeline that was presented to me by Colliers. They did a nice, monthly cash flow analysis for all 12 years. So typically, as you see in the first column, I've labeled these February 23 all the way up to February 34. Generally, we've been on a bonding cycle where we would issue typically in February. So I took their cash flows and I kind of molded them into what our typical bond timeline would be on any particular year. And I will say that, in past years, or at least in recent years, we've had the luxury of being able to kind of bond every other year because we've been able to rely on our general fund balance to provide cash for projects in the interim year. And we save a little bit of money because we don't have to issue bonds every year. But I think when we start getting into, some major projects, and for purposes of this analysis, I assumed we would need to bond every year because we don't have the cash flow to support some of these numbers. And there's other options too. We might end up issuing short-term notes to kind of carry us through the year and double up in bonds in another year. There's a lot involved with that. We kind of try to look at what the interest rates are doing. Are they going up or down, or do we see, are we better off bonding sooner than later to take advantage of lower rates as there are in the environment that we are in right now? I'm just going to skip over to the right-hand column. When I was projecting these bond amortizations, I used a interest rate assumption where I started at 2.5% in the short term, ranging all the way up to 4%. And that's because we're kind of in an unusually low interest rate environment right now. Typically, when I do projections for the town, I'll use 4% if I'm doing any kind of long-term projections. But I thought for purposes of these comparisons that I would use a graduated scale over the next 12 years because I don't see the interest rates jumping from 2.5 to 4%, all in 1 year. So just again, those are some of the assumptions I used. So you'll see in more or less the first column with numbers, the cash flow. This is the cash flow. So February 23, I projected that we would need to bond 14.192 million approximately, based on the cash flow that was provided by Colliers for Project 1A, and so on and so forth. So through the course of the 12 years for the entire project, we're going to need cash flow of 419 million. We don't need to bond that much because we're going to get grant reimbursement. So that's what I showed in the second column, basically matching up the grants that we're expecting to get reimbursed with the cash dispersed through the course of the 12-year period. So I come up with a net number, which I have under the column labeled Scenario 1A. So you can see that the total over the 12-year period for Scenario 1A is 270,886,500. So again, that's all money. These are capital projects I'm going to have to issue bonds for. In addition, we also have capital projects that will be required to maintain our buildings that might not, be part of Scenario 1A per se. This is what Vin did in when he was talking about the Board of Ed's most recently proposed capital expenditure plan, which is a 5-year plan. And so what he did is, he made some assumptions about what that might look like in years, say, 10 through 15. And then Colliers took that and adjusted that to account for, some of the buildings that might be coming offline for these scenarios. So for Scenario 1A, in the column labeled Board of Ed Capital Expenditure Plan, these are the bonds that total 22 million that I'm projecting that we're going to need to cover Board of Ed capital costs that are above and beyond what's involved specifically in Scenario 1A. So I don't know if anybody has any questions on that, but that's, basically the back page of what I used for projecting our amortizations. And if there's no questions, I'll just jump into the results of this, which I put in a a debt service summary. Actually, it's a little bit more than debt service because I did include a column here for operational savings per se. And I'll speak to that a little bit more, but you know, I think both of these scenarios involve the closing of Darcy and Humiston. And so Vin prepared this summary of what some of those savings might entail in detail for each of those buildings. So you have Darcy on the top portion here with a $365,000 per year savings if that building is taken offline. And on the bottom is Humiston with about 163 plus $163,000 savings per year. So I built that into my cost summary. And again, I know it says debt service summary, but I did build in operational savings based on the closure of just those two schools, which total $529,750. And I just went with that all the way through the spreadsheet. Those operational savings will mitigate what the debt service increases are for each of these scenarios.
Excuse Jim, this is Don. But wouldn't it be a closing of Chapman as well in scenario 1A?
You know, I kind of went with what they provided. So if Vin or Colliers might have something on that.
Because 1A is the new elementary school, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, Don, you're right. We are taking off Chapman, but I think, and Vin can allude to this, but the fact is we're building a bigger elementary school to take the same amount of children there. It's going to be a bigger school. The electricity and fuel costs will probably be more because there's more systems. I don't know if Vin wants to opine further, but basically you're relocating, you're taking schools and kids and redistricting and actually adding square footage on those. So I'm not sure, there'd be a certain level of detail if showing that coming offline, is truly reflective with bringing on a newer one. Kind of similar conversation we just had with, Dodd. I think we could talk about that certainly more, in that scenario.
Yeah, Chuck, what I would add to that is just very simply, you're replacing Chapman with another school. So we didn't assume any savings when you do that. And just to kind of touch quickly on, closing Humiston and closing Darcy, the savings comes primarily because we're assuming that, Darcy, even though we're closing the building, all the Darcy programs move to Highland in this case for discussion purposes. So the savings that you're going to realize are in specific areas. The staffing is the biggest saving. So we're assuming that we won't need a school nurse at Highland that we have at Darcy because we have 1.5 nurses at Highland. And same thing, secretary and a building maintainer. The important thing to note, and I'm sure the committee realizes this, what you're not going to save by moving students to another building is teachers and the cost of services that we provide. So that's why you don't see any savings, from teachers in these two particular scenarios.
I had a similar thing to Don's question. This is Kate. Even though it's not operational savings, have you represented what the savings is? Because all of those capital projects that you have planned in the pipeline for Chapman would come offline because you have a new building. Can you quantify that?
Yeah, that's what
was reflected in my spreadsheets. That first group of the spread.
Can you bring that up, John, and bring up just 1A and show where we took off the Chapman, just so we can show Kate exactly where that was?
Sure, I'm just gonna have to stop. I'll have to switch screens again.
That's all right.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah, Paul, I just like to be able to show it and, demonstrate that.
Kate, the reason that, it's shown in two separate places is because they are two separate budgets. The capital budget is separate, and funded differently than the operating budget.
Go to 1A, John, down below.
Oh, sorry. I'll go to Chapman.
Yeah, right. That should show.
Here's
pretty
Chapman.
much. We pretty much erased everything out of Chapman in what Vin had, Kate, there.
Okay. I'm sorry. It was just hard,
Yeah, very
small.
hard to see.
it's hard to
Yeah,
see
a lot of
that,
information. Nope, no problem.
But I appreciate you going back. Thank you.
Yeah, no
No
worries.
problem. Switch back to the other screen.
I just had one other question going back to that. So, but if we're going to close Humiston and we're going to incur leasing costs for space, then isn't that kind of the same thing? Or because one of the things I had brought up, why aren't we thinking about putting additional space onto the elementary school new build for the Board of Ed offices rather than lease new space? But if you're going to close and take all those costs out of Humiston, you're going to have to make those costs up somewhere else, right?
Yeah, you're right, Don. It depends on the scenario. And in one of the scenarios, I know that Humiston was being built into the new middle school. So I know Jim explained that he just took the 529,750 for purposes of these assumptions tonight and showed it happening year over year. We will need to adjust that for each scenario. We have to make this a little bit tighter, but in an effort to get
No, I
prepared
get it.
tonight.
I just try to follow along, and it's hard because some of these numbers, my eyes aren't as good, and it's hard to see some of these numbers here. So, but yeah, I just trying to follow along here.
Yeah. And there's an immense amount of detail we're hitting you with tonight. So, I think it'll help, as we finish talking through, we share this with everybody. It'll take a couple of discussions to really, first of all, make sure everybody understands how we prepared this, and then really refine, these assumptions so that everybody on the committee is comfortable with the assumptions.
Yeah, Don, and I think you bring up a great point. In the numbers we presented for both the elementary school and the new middle school, we have not reflected putting central office in at this time. I know it's been discussed. I just want to be clear so nobody assumes we haven't added. I think, Vin, you're saying, I think 7,500 square feet is what you guys would need for central office or thereabouts.
Yeah.
We can certainly add that into our matrix if the committee wants us to do so, and upgrade those. I think it'd be a small, when it comes to the monthly cost per taxpayer, I don't know if it's going to bump it that much, but I think the point, that's a great point you're bringing up, Don, is yeah, we're trying to show the savings, but the reality is, okay, you take Humiston offline and whatever those operating costs, we put them into the new project, so be it, right? If it's in there, but if we have to lease space, you're probably looking at, I don't know what the lease cost would be, but, I'm not sure if it'd be a savings. It might be an add, if anything, in reality, depending on what you use for those costs, so.
Chuck, I think Rob has a question.
Yes, thank you. Chuck, if we add the administrative space to a new building, is that reimbursable?
Typically, it has been, Rob. There's been multiple districts, Branford, down Francis Walsh Intermediate School, Torrington High School is just going out now. They have it in there. And they typically, I think they've changed it, but in the past, there would be two different grant applications. I think they've consolidated it to one for simplicity. But the reimbursement rate is 50% of what your project reimbursement rate would be for a central office.
Okay, so it's 50% of what you normally get with on a new building is in the high 30s, correct?
Yeah, I think you guys are around 35, 36%, if I remember correctly.
35.
35. So you'd be roughly 17.5% thereabouts for the central office portion. And we had to break the costs out with them and show them separately and substantiate those. But they are reimbursable. It comes into play with the overall discussion of master planning for your district and in the need and so forth. But they do participate. Yes.
Thank you, Chuck.
Yes, sir.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I'll continue with just kind of summarizing what's on this cost summary. And again, those first two columns with numbers are the debt service. The first column being on scenario 1A project costs, and the column to the right, other Board of Ed capital projects, is more or less our projection of capital expenditure plan Board of Ed costs that are outside of the scope of the project costs, project 1A costs. So, typically we bond 20-year bonds. I suppose you could bond longer than that, but, I think rating agencies like to see debt paid off sooner than later. And it's likely that we will stick with a 20-year bond issue for these, although that's something we'll certainly discuss with our financial advisor when it comes time. So the timeline here, I start with fiscal year 23, and I think it goes all the way out to fiscal 55. So we're talking a 32-year period, which is the 12 years of the timeline for the disbursements under each project scenario, plus another 20 years of payoff of that debt. And, I don't want to show you the spreadsheets that went into how all of this was summarized, but at the end of the day, we have a total of 365 million of debt service associated with scenario 1A, and another 28 million in change associated with debt service with Board of Ed projects that are outside of the scope of scenario 1A. And then we have an offset for 16 plus million based on operational savings, which gives me a net cost of 377 million over this 32-year period. I just want to digress for a minute. When I took into consideration the grants that we're expecting from these projects, Chuck reminded me that there is a retainage that's withheld by the state of about, I believe, 11%. I did not build that retainage into this projection. And, theoretically, I probably should consider it somehow, maybe in a separate column, because we will be getting that, or most of that 11%. So we will have to bond for that 11%, because in the short term, we're going to need that cash. But at some point, we will have a little bit of a windfall when we ultimately do receive it after the state audits the project costs, which can take some time from what I've seen. So that 377 million of debt service and operational savings, and that's the best what we could come up with for today. And the three columns on the right, I took into consideration what the average annual mill rate would be for each of those annual costs, the total project costs, and what that would translate to for an average taxpayer. And it's typically what we use in our budget document: average taxpayer, homeowner with 2 cars. And I showed the average annual cost and the monthly cost for each year of the 32-year timeline. And I think probably, you know, it all boils down to, if you take the average, it's an average for this scenario of $730 per year, or $60.90 per month. You know, there's a lot of things that could change that. Obviously, if some of the phases were pushed out, it could make a big difference in what these average annual costs would be. Also, you know, I mentioned that I had used a interest rate assumption of 2.5% graduating up to 4%. But that could be lower. I mean, it's possible that the interest rates will stay generally low for some time, or not. So just for comparison purposes, to give you an idea, I ran it with just a 2%. And if you look in the right-hand column, that would bring the average monthly cost down to $57.48. And then I ran it on the high side with a full boat 4% across all bond issues, which is typically what I use to be conservative when we're projecting long-term cash outlay, which results in a $65.22 monthly cost on average for this scenario. This does not take into consideration any potential for grand list growth. We've had a couple of good years in the last year or two. We just came out with our grand list results today. So, you know, that could mitigate the average cost over the years if our economic situation improves. And I don't know, you know, if anybody has any questions on this scenario, but I basically did that for both scenarios. And I think you see the other one came out to be a little bit more. If we look at the total on scenario 2A, so these are the bonds that I calculated, pretty much did the same thing for scenario 2A. This had a total project bonds of 290 million. So I think it was a little bit more than the previous scenario. And then if you look at the summary I did for that, and we go to the total average cost, this one has a total average annual cost that I projected of 67.11 per month. You know, and I know there's been talk too where you know, maybe we start with phase one, phase two, maybe doesn't get done right away. And again, that would have a huge change to, you know, what these annual costs would be over time. I think we're going to have to take, you know, all of those scenarios into consideration, because these are, you know, large increases that we're projecting. I don't know if anybody has any questions on what I did, but I think this just kind of gives you some idea of what we're looking at in total.
I have a question.
Yeah, Matt.
Does this take into consideration any type of town funding for any capital improvements?
It does not. I didn't include anything outside of the Board of Ed for this, and that's a good point. You know, we have existing debt service that I didn't build into this summary. We're certainly going to look at that. You know, I think at this point it was a matter of comparing one scenario versus the other scenario. But you know, we're certainly going to have to look at what happens when we add this debt service onto our existing debt service. I know that, we heard from South Windsor and they were in I think a good situation in that they had declining debt service, but we had a water pollution control plant upgrade a few years back, and our debt service is not decreasing significantly anytime soon. So this, these costs would be above and beyond that. And so, I will certainly fold that in when we look at the budget this year, and as this gets further along, and add it to our existing debt service so we can take a look and see what that looks like.
Thank you. And I would love to have a copy of this also. Thank you.
Rob, I think, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. And Matt and Jim, thank you for that. That was going to be my statement, that this doesn't include any other increases, not only from an operating budget perspective, but a capital investment perspective. So I think it's important that, at least from my perspective, that we take a look at that going forward, because we have made some other investments in water pollution control. We did a pretty good job of offsetting some of that debt service with a debt service reserve account. I know most of that is gone. So, I really want to see how this lays out. It's really not appropriate to assume, it is for this purposes for the moment, but it's not appropriate to assume that our operating budget stays flat, there's no increase, and that we don't have any other strategic investments from a capital perspective. So I think we need to roll that into this.
Yeah.
The other question that I had, which is a little off topic, is getting back to reimbursement of the administrative offices. And this is back to Chuck Warrington. To the extent we renovate a building and we decide to put the administrative offices in the building that we renovate, is it safe to assume we would get 50% of that reimbursement rate, which is a bit higher than the new construction?
I would want to confirm with the state, but I believe so, Rob. Yeah, so if we renovate instead of being new, which is lesser, 36%, you're asking, okay, and a 45%. I believe it would be half of the 45%, but I'd want to confirm that with the state, just to verify.
Yes, that is exactly what I'm asking. And if you can get that question answered, I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you, Chuck.
John, can you minimize the presentation so we can see everybody if there's any more questions or anything? Sorry.
Sure, no problem.
There we go.
The other thing I might add is that as we fine tune some of these assumptions or make any changes going forward, now that I have some models set up, I should be able to, quickly come up with what the impact would be. And I'm working with our town's financial advisor as well, so that, when it comes time, we can easily present this in conjunction with our existing debt service for subsequent presentation.
And Jim, you've only done just the average taxpayer in the town of Cheshire, not anything commercial or industrial.
No, that's correct.
Thank you.
Got it. Is there any other questions for anybody there? So that was obviously a lot of information. Chuck, John, will get that in PDF form here, and then distribute that out to the committee, and we can follow up on that again on our next meeting, if everybody's good. All right, Jen, did you want to take on agenda item number 6 here?
Yes. Next item is to talk about the community survey. Rich had sent it out to everybody to review, and there were comments that were sent back to Rich as of the end of the day on Monday. And then Rich, you held a meeting last night to talk about those comments and try to incorporate them into the survey. And Jerry, thank you for sticking with us for the last 2 hours. So I'll pass it off, Rich, to you, and we can talk about where you are with this.
Okay. Because it is so late, I'll move along as quickly as I can. As you know, this group a couple of months ago approved the concept of developing a survey utilizing the Center for Research and Public Policy. We recommended that to the town council, who approved it, and we have a contract with them. The communication committee, Ann Harrigan, who I had sent out a note to everyone asking if anyone wanted to join our group in developing that survey, and join the group with us. And Jen had sat in on several of the meetings. Chuck, I think, sat in on one of the meetings. Have worked on developing a detailed survey. The survey is designed to help give us an understanding of the various groups that are in town and their attitudes towards the school and towards school modernization and towards the financial implications. We've removed, based on the comments that were made, which I thought were very good. I appreciate those people who took some time and gave us some input. We have removed the specific financial pieces that related to phase one that were in the questionnaire. We've also corrected some of the language related to full day kindergarten and special ed that were questioned. And I ran those by Tony yesterday, and he said the new language looked good. And I've asked Jerry to be here with us tonight to talk a little bit about the process of developing the survey, the process of actually implementing the survey, because I know there's a lot of questions about the two different aspects of it, the phone calling piece and also the online piece, and then a little bit about the format and what kind of information this group should be able to see. So with that in mind, I want to turn it over to Jerry and let him, he sat with us now for 2 hours. I appreciate that, and he can fill us in a little bit.
Sure, thank you. Good evening, all. Thought I would do just that, Richard, is just go through the process first, talk about where we've been, where we have yet to go with the survey, a little bit about the methodology, answer any quick questions you might have about methodology, and then just take it from there. As Richard mentioned, we held a project initiation meeting. In that first meeting, we all agreed on the areas for investigation, which are the chapters within the survey. We then went to task to build some questions around each of those areas that we agreed to. Went back and forth. You see what you have now is draft 5. So that was submitted to you this morning. So we feel comfortable with the survey. We're anxious for any input yet to come. While that's going on, we're working on the sample design, which is the phone numbers that we'll be calling. We'll be preparing to train the researchers on the phone instrument. We do a pre-test just to make sure everything works after the survey's approved. And then we go into full-scale fielding. Quality controls in place where we monitor some of the calls, we verify some of the calls. Once all 400 phone surveys are completed, then we move to computer analysis, data analysis, and then report writing. The final report will include a statement of confidentiality. We'll have an introduction so that folks that are not as familiar with the process can get an understanding of how this came to be. The methodology that was used, which for the phone survey will include the margins for error, the statistical validity of the survey. We then have a highlight section in all of our reports, which are those things that struck us as important that should be paid attention to. Then we have a summary of findings, which is a narrative question by question of the results with graphs and tables and charts. The report includes the composite aggregate data. We include in the report the survey instrument so that people that are reading the report can quickly refer to the survey to see how it was worded. We run a lot of cross tabulations. So the cross tabulations are very insightful, they're very helpful. That's where we begin to profile the likely supporter of school modernization, the likely opponent. But we're able to look at results by things like gender, education, age, length of residency, whether they have children in the school system, things like that, which will guide the communication team on how to present concepts and ideas to the public over time too. So cross tabulations of data are very important. When we started this process, we suggested that you do a 400 sample survey town-wide. Most of the surveys, we've been doing surveys since 1979 all around the country. Most surveys are in the range of around 300 to maybe 1,000. For all of our college and university clients, we're doing 1,000 nationally. So doing 400 sample in a municipality is credible. It's statistically sound. And that's the one we want you to rely on for results mostly. Concurrent with this is a sister survey that would be open to the public. Everyone's welcome to participate in an online version of the exact same survey. So that survey will be posted on websites, the town website, on Facebook, on all of your partners, on the chamber website, perhaps. Any partner that's willing to post the link to that online survey can do that. You're likely to get, in some communities get, thousands or thousands of completions in that survey. But it's done for a number of reasons. It's done so that the community feels like they've had an opportunity to participate beyond the 400 that are randomly selected to get the phone call. And then just a word on going back to the phone survey, those 400 are randomly selected using a random digit sampling procedure. We know the prefix that we're calling into, and the phone numbers are computer generated because we're not calling businesses. The businesses are purged out of that sample, and then we begin calling. The sample's pulled proportional to geographic contributions citywide or townwide rather. We use the census basis for that pull of the sample. That's pretty much it. That's the methodology, the process, what your report will look like. Once the survey is approved, then we'll book it for the phone bank and get started with the calls. And then we convert the survey. It's in a phone version right now. We convert that to an online version. So for example, instead of saying, please tell me, we'll say, please indicate in the online version. And that will be open to the public too. So I know there was some question about length. I just wanted to cover that briefly just to assure you that what you have in front of you is a relatively short survey. If you think of a bell curve, the standard bell curve where it starts low, goes up to a peak, and then comes back down, 90% of our surveys are probably in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 minutes. So they would be at the peak of that curve. You're at 10 minutes right now, 10, maybe a minute or two over for some folks, but an average of 10 minutes. On the other side of that curve are surveys that we do that are 45 minutes long. Our surveys for the Centers for Disease Control, they're called the BRIFIS survey, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. That's 45 minutes, and we get high completion rates for that. We just finished a survey for Gilpin County in Colorado. They had 120 questions, and our completion rate was 75. So I was conveying to the communication committee earlier yesterday that in most communities, folks like the opportunity to voice their opinion. They rarely get that opportunity to do that. So we expect that this Cheshire Community Survey would probably be in the neighborhood of a completion rate of 75%. That's what we see as an average or a norm for this kind of poll or survey. So we expect a high completion rate. That doesn't mean that 25% are refusing either. It means that they can't do it at that time, and we complete our quota and we're done with the 400 samples, so we don't need to get back to them. They may have had to go off to a soccer game. Possibly they didn't qualify because they're a visiting relative in town. They're not a resident. So there might be reasons why that other 25% are not a completed call too. So with all that said, and also on timing too, it's something that we are very good at. We know time because it's a factor in how we book our phone bank. It's a factor in labor. It's a factor in the time commitments to our clients. So we understand how long surveys take, and probably 20 questions equates to about 5 minutes for our researchers. And a reminder that our researchers are trained. We're going to hear grandma's stories about their grandkids in the course of these calls, but the researchers are polite and they know how to get people back on track and get through the survey in a timely fashion. So very polite folks that'll be making these calls. They're not sales folks. We typically don't hire telemarketers to do this because it's a very different approach to people. So we'll be using a mixed access process so that we're getting cell phones as well as landlines during this process. So I hope that just gives you the broad picture without belaboring it too much. Very happy to answer any questions that you have about the process or methodology.
Go ahead, Tony.
Oh, Jared, really quick. Thank you so much. Yeah, my initial reaction when I saw those questions, I was like, my goodness, if I had to read this to someone on the phone and I can't stay on cue, it'll be a very long conversation. So I thank you for clarifying that the length of the questionnaire survey is within, a short range. So I appreciate the work on that and
Sure.
that committee as well. Thank you.
Chuck?
How long will it take to get from initiating the survey to getting the final report to the committee?
So roughly, when you approve the survey, then we'll book the phone bank. This will take about a week, maybe a week and a few days to field the telephone survey. Then another week to do the analysis, run the data reports, and then a few days to write the report. So you're looking at, after you approve it, probably a few weeks. But you've also got the concurrent online survey going on, and you want to keep that open as long as you possibly can. So I'll work with the communication committee to see how much time and when they'd like the results by, and we'll try to back out of that date enough time to have that in the field, because you have to allow some time for the news release about the link to appear. We need to get those results back too. So probably about a month in all from day one, survey approval to getting a report in your hands. And then we'll do it just like we are tonight, is that we'll just do a PowerPoint presentation to you.
So if it were a month and you issued the survey next week, we'd have the results like the 28th of February.
Yeah, or yes, roughly. I have to check the phone bank schedule because I can't book that until we have survey approval, but late February, early March.
Thanks.
Anyone else have any questions, comments?
Just real quick, Jen, if I could. And I know this was asked before, but have we confirmed what the phone number that this will be coming from is, the area code that people could be expecting to get a call from?
Yeah, we haven't decided yet. We're trying to, and we'll probably have this come out of Connecticut phone bank versus our Vermont or Arizona phone bank. So it's likely to be an 860 phone number. That's what we're working on or towards, and I'm pretty sure that's what we'll do.
Okay. Yeah, I would recommend that just because of the number of people that ignore calls.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree.
Along that same line, Sean, is there a way for us to announce that this is going to happen? I know you use the robo call type things, and I know that's for emergency use only, but is there something similar to that we could use to alert people to look out for this phone call?
Yeah, I mean, it would certainly help if there's a specific number used. And I don't know, Jerry, if I mean, we could probably talk offline about that. We could certainly publicize that. If you get a number from 860, or particularly 860, 619, whatever, we could certainly get that out to a number of sources. I'd have to look into it more. I don't know about using reverse 911 for that purpose, because that might confuse people that are thinking they're getting the survey and they're actually just getting me telling them about a survey. So I could look into some other options, but when we did something similar in the town I worked for before, we had a kind of a public information campaign saying, if you get the call, take the call. And we had similarly, the actual 860 number just kind of broadcast everywhere and on the town website, just so people, when they got it, they said, oh. It's also helpful to know if the caller ID, Jerry, comes up with the specific name of the business or the phone bank,
Right.
because we publicized that before too.
Yeah, Sean, we actually submitted a draft press release to Richard and his team.
Okay.
With how caller ID might look, the different variations. So we've submitted that. I'm not so sure, because so many different phone numbers will come up. I think it's probably best just to use the name that would appear on the caller ID. But yeah, the news release that we submitted, letting the public know that these calls are coming, and if you're randomly selected, please participate, is always helpful. Always helpful.
Sure, and we can distribute that to a number of places, including online and Treasure Herald online, things like that.
Thank you.
Sylvia, go ahead.
I initially, I was reluctant to see this survey go out immediately because of some of the questions that were there, but I have to compliment the committee for listening to me and to other people, I think, who had also made some suggestions about what they were concerned about. I feel like the survey as it is today is far more directed to the general information that we're trying to elicit from people, which is, do you support modernization? What do you think should be done? What are your primary concerns about what's happening? So I'm much more comfortable with the content of it. I think that's what we did with asking the teachers and the staff of the schools. We are putting all of those pieces together. And after our meeting today with the state, I think it's important that we have some public input. But I am absolutely opposed to having all that financial information. So I appreciate that you eliminated that from my personal perspective. And in listening to all of the other pieces this evening that we have to get accomplished, I think there is good reason to proceed with it. I do think that we can get some cooperation from the council if we don't present this on March 1st and we present it on March 8th. I don't think that's going to be a serious issue. So if we had to wait at the result of the survey for a day or two, I think that doesn't affect the timeline seriously. So so that's where I stand, and I appreciate the committee's. I watched the meeting. I was not able to attend the meetings that you invited us to because I had other commitments, but you responded and had great dialogue and great conversation about arriving at this decision. So I support that. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Don, go ahead.
Thank you. And I want to thank the people who did send the emails. I had some similar questions from what I saw in the emails that were sent, and I appreciate the committee looking at them and making the changes that they did. I mean, and I do. I mean, I don't think these people were saying that they know how to do a survey better than Jerry's group. I think they were just concerned about the questions, and I think that's what the committee has to understand as well. It wasn't questioning how to do a survey; it was questioning so we all understand why we are doing this survey. I have a question about when is there a reason why we want it done by March? It's not to help us choose the scenario, is it? Or it's just to get a feeling for the overall feeling of the town? I mean, is it a rush to get it done by March 1st, like we have to get, the, our scenario chosen by then? Or is this something that maybe we wait, choose our scenario, and then find out how the town is going to feel about this so we could tweak it? I just don't know, why we're doing the survey now versus later. And I'm sure there's a good explanation, but I just like to hear it.
Are you looking for an answer from someone specific, or Rich, do you want to
And
take that?
anybody who has an answer.
Okay.
Well, when we first brought it up, you'll recall this group had some difference of opinion. And there were people who felt the data would support this committee, support the Board of Ed, and support the town council as they were coming to some final conclusions. So at least they would have some detailed information regarding the attitude of people in town and their willingness to support these projects. There were other people who felt that it could be done later and it would give us information as we were moving towards communicating out with the staff and moving it from there. So, right from the beginning, we had said to Jerry that we really wanted to do it sooner rather than later, because we wanted this committee, the town council and the Board of Ed, to have this information in hand while they were making decisions, and not, looking back and saying, gee, I wish we knew some of this information as we were coming to final conclusions. And without knowing what those conclusions are going to be, it's hard for me to tell, but I'm hopeful that it's going to support us in some of the final decisions that we make.
But it's not going to be for the decision that, I think this group is going to have already have come up with our decision probably by the time we get the results, or we'll be pretty close to a decision, I would think. So that's why I'm questioning whether we're using this to help us make that choice, or are we using this survey to help us, convince the public after we make our choice. The
only difference between doing it now and doing it after we make our choices, that we'd be able to begin to publicize what the final decision is. Either way, I think, we're going to get a lot of good detailed information on where the people in town stand and what they're feeling at the moment. If you looked at the kind of questions that are there. The other piece of this, it does help educate people. So if we can get 400 people on the phone and maybe 1,000 doing it, there are items in there that say, are you aware that, we have gone to a full day kindergarten and that uses some additional.
Wouldn't you think that if you do a survey after we've already chosen a scenario and say, what do you think of this idea, and move it forward from there, we'd get more of a play on it? That's my opinion on that. I don't know if I'm on an island by myself, but
I don't know, Don. It's an issue that's been,
Yeah, I know. Okay. Well, believe me, I appreciate all the work you guys have put into this. I know you put in a lot of hours, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate you listening to the people who sent the emails to make the changes that you did do. So thank you.
So if I could jump in and add to that a little bit, it's kind of twofold. So it is to kind of give us an idea of what the town is willing to vote for. It's also to help us understand where those pieces are that we can market to and how we need to approach our selling of the plan. But also we will be going to the town council with the recommendation, not a final plan. So there will be time to adjust. There will be, even in phase 2, phase 3, it will be useful information moving forward. So just because we present a recommendation, we may have a backup recommendation as well. So if the first one doesn't work out for whatever reason, we have a backup to fall back on, and we can then use that information from the survey to help us guide through those iterative decision-making processes.
And Jennifer, can I add to that? This is not a political poll, but it will in the end give some guidance to the communication committee as to the things that are most important to residents about modernization, the degree to which they support modernization and the reasons why they do. Some of the mistakes our clients make in trying to get the community on board over a renovation, over something new, is that they shotgun it. They don't know what's important. So many times they're talking about things that are not important to people. This survey, as it is today, will equip you to completely understand what's important about modernization to people, so that you're talking about those 3 or 4 things instead of 15 other things that are not important to them. So it will give you a good picture of the community, why they support, why they oppose, what's important to them if you do modernize the schools, and globally, why would they support it as well too.
Yeah, Jerry, I piggyback on your point. Is exactly what we were getting at too in the committee. Is the sooner we get the analytics in our hand, the better equipped we are as a group to make decisions and really cater our communications to exactly what the community wants to hear. Because there is some debate on exactly what our communication should be, and what data points we should be talking about and pressing. And the sooner we have the results of the survey, the more equipped we'll be able to do that. So thank you for adding.
Can I jump in here? And I'd say I agree with everything you all said, but I think you're missing one important point. As a resident, I want to be able to have a voice in what happens, however that is. And if I feel like I have a way to communicate my ideas to you in an easy way online, even if I don't get called on the phone, but I could sit online and I could type in my preferences, I feel like that you're listening to me at a point where you have not yet come to a decision. So my input perhaps will have some sway. You know, I mean, it's a perception of a person, but they feel like I have an opportunity to let you on that committee know what is important to me. And I think sometimes we, in the political world or in this governmental world, the perception is that we don't listen, but we don't always give people an easy way to respond. And in this case, this is a simple way to get a response from somebody. So to that point, I would support it. I do think we have to be very careful, and we want to encourage people to support the plans that we're doing, but there's a fine line between advocating for a plan and just presenting the facts. And I think as a communications committee, we have to be careful about just perception wise, this is what we're proposing because these are the facts and this is what has driven us to this place. But the advocacy has to come from an independent PAC or whatever it is. It's totally separate from this group. This group is presenting a plan that we have vetted and we thought that was the best plan for the community to look at and consider. And we need to present you with the facts, and that's where we have to be careful to just stick to the facts.
Good point.
And so there's just a very fine line between that and between becoming an advocacy for a position. So an advocate for a position. So I think it gives people an opportunity to speak to the issues and feel like they're being heard, because often we hear that nobody listens to me. Well, we're trying to listen to you, so we're giving you that opportunity. So I've come 360 in my opinion in the last couple of days. Okay.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
To add to what Sylvia said, you know, we have had people make comments to the committee, write emails and so forth, but you know, they've been very few and far between. We've had a lot of repeat comments, and really this is an opportunity to broaden that perspective and get a much wider view of how the community feels about this project. And you know, I agree, you know, people need to have a voice. It's, you know, we need to get their opinions in before we've really finalized decisions, so that people feel like their opinion is valuable, because it is. We need the community support to make this go forward. So this is one way to help us get that.
Tony, you had something?
Yeah. No, I agree.
Whoops. Oh, sorry. Tony had his hand up earlier. I'll get to you next, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with all the comments, and I want to thank the committee for taking my feedback on the questions. I think the survey is fine. One thing that made us a little selfish was Board related. I believe this survey is going to help the Board of Ed immensely, those results, because once the Board of Ed starts working the education specs, and we have some of these survey details, I know that the Board of Ed will be hopefully inundated by the public. I'm thinking predominantly parents, students that, some of which who might have been called to the survey are going to have some feedback for us, some ideas, and want to be part of that process. So the Board of Ed will use these results certainly to help move that process forward. So definitely has a lot of value even after our work is done in this group on those options. So thank you.
Em?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of what Sylvia said also, because, and Kate, because we've talked a lot about this in our committee's meetings. And it's about getting the pulse of the community, the residents of Cheshire, the taxpayers. Now, we've already gotten, we've done a lot of going into the schools, talking to the teachers, talking to the student, not the students. We've looked at the other constituencies, and now it's time to get the community voice. And I agree with Sylvia. This is a systematic way for people to know that they had an opportunity to voice how they feel about this idea of a big modernization of all of our schools in town. And they can choose not to participate, but they have the opportunity and they'll know all about it. So I think it's great.
We may be surprised at the results.
We may be surprised at the results.
Don, go ahead.
I just had one last thing for Richard, actually. Have you thought of talking to the Chamber of Commerce about maybe sending this out to businesses that see?
Yeah, well, the business piece is one that you brought up earlier, and
Yeah.
we tried to keep that really uppermost in our mind. Jeff is going to be taking that piece on, and we very specifically have talked about making sure that we get together with the Chamber of Commerce and get them to very specifically get this out to their members. And he's got several other groups, some of the sports groups and things like that, that he's going to be addressing. So yeah, so we've kept that business piece very uppermost. We want to be able to break that out separately.
Okay.
How this does affect the business community.
No, I just figured the chamber could be helpful in that end of it. So thanks.
Yes. That's on the agenda.
Chuck, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I would say my issue with the survey in the previous form, and again, I echo everybody's comment as far as taking into consideration the comments we had there. My issue was the financial piece that we had in there for the survey. And I think now without that, the only action that we have coming out of this is how to market the plan. And I just don't think the timing of it makes sense for how to market the plan if we don't even know if we have a plan that's approved by the town council to move forward. So I don't see the benefit of doing it now versus including some of that financial information when it's a little further along the lines, a little more final, and doing the survey after we know which direction we're going, and then we know how to market that plan afterwards. That's still my issue with doing it now. Or concern, I guess. That's all.
Okay. I think it's you have to weigh what you get from it versus what you get if you wait. I think if you were to go now, it does give us some information that we can use in the month of March if we are still doing that iterative approach that we talked about, how we have to kind of review where we are and possibly have some questions and make adjustments. I think it would be valuable at that point to have that information. If everyone disagrees with that, that's something we can definitely discuss. But I kind of feel like most people are on board with the fact that getting that information sooner rather than later is more helpful. And the aspect of making sure people feel like they are being heard before decisions are made, or at least during the same time period where decisions are being discussed and made, it will go a long way for credibility, for making people feel heard, and for making sure that when we do go to the polls, people do remember that and feel like they were listened to. Anyone else have any thoughts? Okay, so is everyone in agreement that it will go out? The only one I heard against is Chuck, but does anyone else have any? Is everyone, Don, are you?
I agree with Chuck. I'm on the same page as him. Maybe we should just take a vote.
Okay, we can do that. So officially, legally, would someone like to make a motion?
I'll make a motion to send out the survey.
Okay.
Second.
In seconds, and any discussion? We already kind of had the discussion, but.
What exactly did Jeff say is his motion? He just said a couple of words.
The motion is to send out the survey at this time, whenever Jerry is ready to send it out, I guess. But to move forward with the survey now.
Okay.
And then Jim seconded it. Okay, all in favor of sending out the survey now and approving the content and moving forward with it at this point? Everyone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Anne, your hand up or no? Oh, 9, 10. I think I got 10. Does that mean 3 against? Chuck, Don, and no? I must have counted wrong.
Matt might be abstaining or.
Oh, Matt, that's right. I can't see Matt.
Is Matt Bowman in favor or not?
I don't know. I
Matt.
don't see his screen, and he's muted, so I don't know what his vote is.
Oh, okay.
So it's 10 versus 2 at this point, with one
And one abstention.
One non-vote. Okay, so the motion passes.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate all the input we've gotten. I'm very hopeful that this is going to be a very positive and informational piece for everyone. So I want to thank the committee for all their time and energy they've put into this. I want to thank Jerry, who's gotten my daily emails, so and who sat through 3 hours this evening.
Sure.
Okay, Jerry, go for it. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you all. And Richard and Jen, I'll get a timeline to you tomorrow.
Thank you.
And with that, we are at the end of our agenda. Our next meeting is on Monday, the 1st. We will talk about the scenarios and the financials again and discuss how we proceed at that point. And with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Tony.
Second.
Second, Don. All in favor? I'm sure you
No,
all.
I can't.